This is Turn Stories, and I'm your host, TR Jordan. If you were writing front end in 2013, you probably remember how great CoffeeScript and Knockout.js were. They're just light years ahead of early Angular or jQuery or anything else. But they didn't win. So today, I got to talk to Hal and Neil, a staff engineer at Braze, about their years-long journey migrating from Knockout and CoffeeScript to React and TypeScript. There's some amazing lessons in here. How to get started, what components get people to actually move to the new tech stack quickly, and even how to make adding types to JavaScript feel kind of fun. I think you're going to love it. Welcome, Hal. Glad to have you here.
Hi, glad to be here. Excited to talk.
Right on. So, I am excited to hear the pain of and the glory of doing this migration. But before we get into it, tell me a little bit about where Braze was when you joined. How big was the company? What do they do? What were the things that landed you there?
Yeah. So I guess just rewinding slightly even further back, I actually have knew a bunch of people. I knew a bunch of people from college who work at Braze, and they were talking about like wanting to go into this migration. They kind of didn't really necessarily have a specific plan of how to tackle it in mind, other than, we need to move away from our existing tech stack, which at the time was Knockout.js and CoffeeScript, to the new one, which was React and TypeScript. And it was mostly agreed upon that, this was the direction that they were going to head down. And they were looking for someone to sort of especially help out in the beginning parts, which they saw as starting with like a shared design library that would be used throughout the application so that we can start standardizing what the UI looked like. And I had experience doing that at NASDAQ for the past 2 years or so. And what ended up happening was like I was kind of looking for a change, looking for something more interesting, more exciting. And they were like, we need somebody who has a little bit of experience at least doing this so that we can just hit the ground running and build this design library. And that will enable and sort of supercharge, hopefully, our transition, our migration into React and TypeScript. So that was kind of the original sell, if you will. And then where was Braze at that time? So this is like we just said, this is 5 years ago. So Braze was about half the size it was at this point. I think it was like just under 1,000 people globally. I remember, I think if you look on Workday, my employee number is like 700 something. And right now we're in the high 1,000s, like 1,700, I think is the latest number. I'm not exactly sure. So, we've pretty much doubled during the time that I've been here and opened a lot of new offices that didn't exist when I joined. And yeah, the migration has taken many forms, obviously. Like I said, it started with the design system and the design library, but it went down many different paths in many different directions. So yes, while we tend to use migration in a sort of singular, this is a one thing that we're doing, it actually also could be thought of as like a bunch of related migrations that all kind of come together to move us from A to B. And that's kind of been my experience so far.
That totally makes sense. What was, from as you were thinking about joining Braze and learning about like, well, they wanted to do this change, makes sense to bring in someone with like outside expertise. What was the straw that broke the camel's back? Because it's not a small decision to rewrite your front end. Was there a single straw that was like, well, all right, that's what we need, now we're gonna do the rewrite? Or was it more a pile of reasons?
I don't think it was necessarily a straw that broke the camel's back. I think there were a bunch of things that kind of coalesced together. There was a technical piece of it, which was that both of the technologies we were using, Knockout.js and CoffeeScript, were dead and abandoned. There was a sort of recruiting aspect to it, which is that like when you're using dead and abandoned technologies, it's harder to find people that know how to use them. And even if people don't know how to use them, they don't necessarily want to learn how to use them. Like, who wants to learn a language or a library that is not really helping you sort of invest in your career growth when no one else is likely to use it in the future, or at least a diminishing number of people are likely to use it in the future. So there was that piece. Another piece was developer velocity. It's simply harder to write things in a safe way in CoffeeScript and Knockout.js compared to React and TypeScript. And they definitely were looking to sort of build a lot more features with a lot more speed. So that's definitely the sort of technical side of it. There's also the design side of it, which is that our design folks were looking to sort of standardize the way our UIs looked and felt across the application. When there's so many different teams working simultaneously on so many different parts and so many different features of a platform that provides things like being able to send emails, being able to send push notifications, being able to create custom audiences and all these things, you don't want it to necessarily look like a patchwork of different applications that were all stitched together. And an easy way to accomplish that is through a design system, which was kind of the first thing that we embarked on when we decided to actually start the migration. And a big proponent of that was our design team saying, hey, if we standardize things like buttons, things like form elements, things like, what have you, then not only will it make it easier and quicker for engineers to build new features, just because they'll just be able to, pick Lego pieces essentially and put them on top of each other, but also the collective output of what everybody's creating will be a consistent and unified experience that looks like a single, well thought through application UI. So those were kind of, I think, the big sort of technical as well as design specific reasons. There are also business reasons, which I guess kind of goes back to those technical and design reasons. Ultimately, it's a good thing for your product to appear polished and for you to be able to launch features quickly without bugs and without getting constantly bogged down by, oh, how do we do this? And it's very complicated and challenging and nobody really understands how we do this. So that also helped the business to invest in our ability to execute on our long-term vision and our objectives and things like that. So that's kind of the coalescing of all of the different factors that led to this moment, that moment of the migration beginning.
That makes sense. So you had engineers who were feeling less and less productive working in CoffeeScript and Knockout. You had a design team who was worried about the app looking like a ransom note because of lack of consistency. You had managers who couldn't hire because they were pitching outdated technologies to engineers, and that all rolled up into the business's inability to ship as fast as they needed to.
Very good.
Makes total sense. So this might sound like a weird question, but when you arrived and started working on this, did you find that there was broad consensus about the need to do this migration right now?
That's a really good question. I would say immediately right off the bat, yes and no. I would say compared to, for example, my experience at NASDAQ, there was definitely much more consensus. I would say NASDAQ, where we were building a design system and we're trying to get other folks to use it, there was a lot of resistance because a lot of these different teams weren't used to collaborating with one another. And so they felt like coming to them and being like, here's a design system, please use it, was encroaching on their territory as opposed to being helpful. My experience at Braze was not like that. People were generally pretty open to using it. And if anything, they were like, hey, you know what, if this, especially from an engineering standpoint, if this makes my life easier on a daily basis, this sounds perfect. Of course, I will use it. At the very beginning, before we proved out that we could, in fact, help them, I think there was a bit of a sort of dissonance between people sort of agreeing on principle that, yeah, of course, we want things to be easier, but then being skeptical that it will, in fact, make their lives easier. So perhaps in the beginning, there could have been a mismatch of like people saying that they would do it, but then not actually taking action immediately, them being like, well, this is new, this is foreign. A lot of people at the time who worked in our engineering organization weren't familiar with React, TypeScript, and anything. So there's this natural sort of aversion to like wholesale throwing out the things, even if they're not the best way to do things, just because you're sort of, it's your comfort zone, right? You're entrenched in what you know how to do, and you're generally incentivized to be able to deliver on these features that you need to move the business forward. it's kind of scary to think, oh, the things that I had been doing all this time suddenly aren't necessarily going to be able to apply. I have to learn all these things while still being um, expected to deliver on these features for the business. So I think at the very beginning there was a little bit of fear around that. Maybe not voiced like, I don't think anybody was running around being like, "Oh my God, I'm terrified." But like, I think you can kind of see it in adoption or lack thereof when you build features. You build like different pieces of the design system, and you see that like maybe it's not getting used as much as you expected it to. And I don't think it came from a place of I don't like this, I don't want to do this. I think it came from a place of I'm not familiar with this. I don't even know where to start, and I don't even know if it's going to be sufficiently helpful for me to be able to do the things that I need to do. I think that was the beginning, and one of the most important things I would say my team did at the time to sort of get over that hump wasn't just to be like, here's a design system, enjoy, goodbye, we'll see you the next time we have a release. It was more, okay, let's actually sit down and talk about React. How does this work? Let's do a little React training. Let's do TypeScript training. Like really going to starting with the basics, because that's where everybody was. And we did, we did sort of workshops with individual teams. Like we would basically put all the team members. So this is also COVID, so not in a room literally, but like, in a Zoom together or a Google Meet together, and kind of walk them through almost like a slideshow of like, this is really like literally starting from the basics of like, this is React, this is TypeScript, here's how it all comes together. Here's how you do something that you would have done in Knockout in React. So those were kind of the early steps in getting that buy-in. I think an interesting thing that happens in those times is, especially early on, when you just want people to use something that you're building, but they're maybe not picking up as quickly as you would want them to, is sometimes to feel like, okay, maybe I should just force them to use this. Maybe I should require them. Maybe I should go above their heads, talk to their managers, and make them do this. But that is absolutely it might work in the short term, but that is not a way to get people to like you, or to, invest in the longevity of whatever it is you're building. So really building a lot of goodwill, establishing competence, and showing people that like, hey, we're trying to help you be better at your job, and not sort of abandoning them to their fate is I would say the way to go, especially when the transition is a large migration such as this one. Smaller migrations, maybe you don't need that, like if it's a small library or whatever. But when it feels like you're changing the entire way you do things, acting as a collaborator and helping people and making it clear that you want to help them succeed is a really big part of the battle, I would say.
That's awesome. So your first step wasn't even writing code or design docs. You'd pick the technology, but the first like tangible step here really was, let's go find the teams that are going to use this, and let's teach them what it's going to be like to live in the new world, which makes a ton of sense, honestly. That it's a big assumption that anybody who doesn't use React every day already knows how to use React.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I would say, some teams are like, the nice thing is that not everybody has the same level of resistance to everything. Some teams inherently, because of the people that are in them, because of the culture of the team itself, are more open to these sorts of things. They're more open to like trying out new things, even if they're not sure that they're going to succeed ultimately. All of that is fine. It's, you have to find the right person and the right team that is, much like how you go out there and find design partners, you kind of have to find the right folks that will help you at the beginning stages, who are more likely to want to go out of their way to try something new, than maybe a team that's like, you know what, we don't want this. Ultimately, they're going to get there too, but you're just going to make your life and their life miserable by attempting to go for the hardest thing first,
Absolutely. So as you were talking to people, I really like this framing of people who are sort of had more affinity to doing the project, or were more resistant.
Mm-hmm.
where did you focus your energy? Did you double down on the people who are already excited? Did you try and convince the laggards? Did you do some mix? Where did
I
you
would
spend
say
your time?
we doubled down on the people who were already excited, especially in the beginning, because our thinking was, hey, we have some folks in some of the teams that are really excited about this, that they themselves have been contributing to this effort. Prior to the creation of what initially was called the dashboard infrastructure team, now is called the front end infrastructure and experience team. Prior to the creation of that team, there was like a ragtag group of engineers that had a vision, and this is even prior to me joining, that like set up the groundwork, and those folks were interested in pushing this forward. So we already had some folks that weren't in the team directly, but who were kind of cheerleaders for the effort, that were willing to sort of be advocates for us within their own teams, which is very, very helpful. Um, in that instance, we kind of started out by being in constant communication with them, talking with them about what it is they needed. One of the big things that we did was, kind of prioritizing which pieces of the design system to build based on the needs at that particular point in time of the potential customers, and that in this case sort of those teams that are more likely to adopt. Obviously certain things when you're building a design system from scratch are pretty obvious and pretty basic. You need buttons, you need text, you need these very basic things that you don't need to talk to anybody to build. But then there are other things that you start to get into where, hey, we're kind of, the other team kind of tells you, we're stuck on this particular feature, we're trying to build this, but we don't have that. So then their design team and our design team would work to understand like what exactly it is that they need, and how, in what timeline, how can we build and deliver features that can really help them. And as sort of we started to give them the functionality that they needed and they adopted it, two things happened. One, they themselves saw, hey, this is actually helping. I'm building things more easily, with more velocity. And then other teams also saw them, because people talk among themselves. And so it's kind of like free advertising in a way for that you're starting to get when team A builds this feature. They hopefully have a good experience building the feature with the tools that you provided them. They talk to this other team who says, oh, that looks cool. Was that really hard to do? And they're like, no, it actually was easier. And that's kind of how it starts to snowball. You kind of have your one example, other people see it, they're like, I want to try this out. And then that happens again and again and again. And eventually I feel like you reach sort of a, what's the term I'm looking for? Like go over the hump, activation energy, I suppose, where like, or critical mass. That's the word I was looking for, or term I was looking for. You reach your critical mass, and suddenly you don't have to go out and try to convince people to use things anymore. They actually start coming to you and are like, hey, we need this from you. We need this other thing. We really want to do, this feature, but, for example, you don't currently provide X, Y, Z. When can you provide that? And then it kind of goes from there.
That's I love that way of thinking, that way of doing it. It's this like classic struggle of platform teams,
Yeah.
where you want to build something and it has to be coherent and good, but at the same time, you work at a company. This isn't the
Right.
product. You are not selling it. You can't be visionary about it, because there's only ever 10, 12, 20 teams who are going to use it, and you need to actually serve their needs in the short term.
Yeah.
How did Let's get into the details of some of the stuff you built. What was the first thing that you built into the design system where a team pulled you into building it and you're like, wow, I didn't think we were going to need that?
Sorry, to clarify, like pulled us in terms of like become part of their process of building it out, or
You knew you had to build text, knew you had to build buttons, but you'd mentioned that there were some weirder things that you had to build, and you would prioritize them
yes.
as part of
Mhm.
the system? What was, I'd love an example of a team.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that comes to mind, this isn't like a particularly like weird or esoteric component or anything like that, but one that comes to mind is collapsibles. So basically, like you have a little box, and then it has potential extra information that you can click to expand or collapse to as a user to see that. I think one of the teams that needed it needed to see this collapsible in order to be able to like provide sort of real-time information about whether the marketing campaign that they were creating was it had any errors or it had things that needed fixing and things like that. And we hadn't yet built it, and so that was one of the first things that we built for them. That wasn't kind of in the obvious set of like buttons and text and stuff like that.
Got it.
Not the most exciting component, admittedly, but again, this is like, when you say first, I feel like oftentimes first really ends up being some of the most basic things. And it starts to build from there, essentially.
How, if you sort of zoom forward, what were some of the more complex things that you ended up building, and how did you navigate that line of where you needed to be part of the design, something that should have been part of the design system versus something which is just like, look, that's just code, you should go write it with the team that owns it?
Yeah, for sure. The one I always think about is our data table component. So it spans all of the things you just said. So I like to think there's kind of three pieces to it, and all these three pieces live in different places. So the first piece is the pure UI. You need tables, HTML tables, and you need them. In this case, they don't really do much other than look the way they should. So they're just mostly styled components that have a particular appearance, and then when you assemble them, they make a table. That was in our actual Beacon design system, and remains in our Beacon design system repository that is distinct from our platform repository. Then the next step was, and the impetus for this was, okay, we need to continue rolling forward with the migration, but a big thing that's preventing us from continuing is SlickGrid. We're using SlickGrid for all of our tables in our platform dashboard, and there's many pages where that's basically the main or essentially the only thing on that page. And until we have some sort of a legitimate replacement, we can't continue along and finish up this migration. And we definitely knew we didn't want to necessarily continue to use SlickGrid for a bunch of reasons, including technical and design and UI, UX, all that stuff. And so the next step then became, okay, how do we create we call them data tables, a data table that essentially feature teams can use to build custom tables that are specific for their use cases, but also one that uses the UI, generates the UI for you, for the most part, so that you don't have to repeat the same things like putting in the body and the header and the cells and whatever every time. And also give it enough flexibility such that, wildly different instances of these tables can be implemented, yet at the same time not giving so much flexibility that, again, you end up in this place of like you're basically just manually putting everything together anyway. So finding that balance is somewhat tricky. And that actually, the data table component was essentially a marriage of the UI elements that we had built in our design system and the React table, now I think it's called 10-stack React table library, that stitched the two of them together and provided a relatively simplified interface, not altogether different from what there used to be, to make it super easy for teams to be able to not only migrate their existing slick grids into this table, but also just create new ones into the future. One of the things that we did was, and this was kind of a point where like the front end kind of started to meet the back end on our team, was looking at how do we minimize the level of effort it will take to transition away. Oh, Jesus. Sorry, I'll say that again. One of the challenges was how do we make it easier for people to transition away from SlickGrid to the back to the data tables. And for that one, for example, we basically said, hey, let's create some hooks and enforce a contract between the APIs of the backend for tables specifically and the UI of the front end, so that you can essentially take this new UI, but you can plug existing API endpoints to it, so that you don't have to even worry about anything happening in the back end, and it's solely a front end project now. And when you say those types of things, engineers tend to get pretty happy and excited, because it's like, oh my god, yes, there's less work I have to do this migration. So that was striking that right balance of like flexibility and interoperability, to create an experience for the developers that gives them the velocity and makes them want to actually adopt this, as opposed to feeling like it's going to be a slog. I think that is the death knell of any migration effort, is that if it feels like your life, it's just going to make your life harder, especially long term, then people tend to be more resistant to them. But if you're like, hey, but even the process of doing this isn't going to be complicated, and when you're done, maintaining it is going to be super easy, people get pretty excited about that sort of thing. And then I guess the third piece of that is actually the end engineers using this sort of middle layer of the data table to create their own specific instances of its usage, whether it's displaying and being able to navigate to all the various campaigns, or seeing a bunch of reporting about how your campaigns have performed in the past, or creating new audiences and being able to select them and see them all in one place. The possibilities are endless.
I love that insight about finding kind of the right like developer experience cut point of saying like, hey, if this becomes a front end plus back end project, all of a sudden, that's going to be a lot. Do you have 2 weeks, 2 quarters out to really do this? And all of a sudden, like, your PM is involved and leadership is asking questions, but saying like, no, it's just a front end project. We're just going to swap this and it's going to work the same, and we're not going to have to change it. Does feel like it'll just take. It sounded like it takes the temperature down a lot.
It 100% takes the temperature down. Yeah, I think it's like people like. Anytime you say the word migration, I think nowadays you get a sort of a trigger response, like people, like the heart rates start going up. I think it just freaks people out. At this point, I've resolved to not call something a migration unless it's like huge and massive and multi-year. I'm like, a refactor, just to keep the heart rates from rising too much. But yeah, I think that is a big piece of like saying you should do this, and it's not going to be that bad for you. Like you need to fast follow with that, and if anything, it's even sweetening the deal by saying like, hey, the end output is it's going to look better, or it's going to be faster, or you're going to write it more quickly, or it's more understandable code, or whatever it is. Like, as long as you sweeten the deal with something that positively impacts their lives in some way, I think people tend to be much more open to it and much less defensive about moving away.
Makes sense. I think one of the things that is frequently going through people's minds is you don't know what you don't know, and it's not clear even if it seems to drop in correctly and the type checker passes that it'll work. How did you think about testing all the way out to like bringing it to production and seeing that component does work in all the ways that you expect it to work when it's in front of real users?
Yeah, I think there's several layers to this, but generally speaking, one of the benefits of moving into this new world was that testing it was also easier than the old stack. And when I say testing in this case, at least for now, I mean automated testing, right? So you just write a bunch of like integration tests. We first actually got this, this is 5 years ago. So initially, Jest and Enzyme was still somewhat the standard way of testing React components. So that's how we started. Then we slowly transitioned over to Cypress testing and integration testing. We layered it on top with end-to-end testing, although that one's a bit trickier because it tends to be a lot more flake that it encounters, and sometimes it doesn't, give you the signal that you want. And in worst case, because of all the noise you're getting, you tend to tune it out, which, kind of defeats the whole purpose of having tests in the first place. And kind of increasing the importance of testing in the organization, because I think at that stage there was a lot of tests for the back end, but there weren't as many tests for the front end. And so pushing in that direction and kind of having that sort of shift of the thought process around like testing is important even for the UI. You know, if a user logs in and is unable to, you know, I don't know, schedule a campaign to send when they want to, that's not gonna look very good for us. You know, I think there's always different levels of emergencies happening. You know, I can't go onto this page could be a problem, but it's typically doesn't rise to the problem level of like, hey, we were scheduled to send, I don't know, 1 million messages and none of them are sending. That's like, you know, all hands on deck situation. So I think it was also reframing the mindset of like the UI maybe doesn't cause an incident that everybody freaks out about, but at the same time, it does influence how customers view our product, whether they find it to be reliable in general, whether they feel that they can do the things that they are paying us to be able to do in a relatively easy way. And so, yeah, I think a lot of that shift has happened towards the automated testing world, and I think we're much better tested as a result, both because of sort of like I said, a mental shift, as well as the technology making it easier to test. Period.
Mm.
And then,
like
yeah,
that
sorry,
was
go.
part of, do you feel like the testing was part of the migration? Because there's a different ecosystem around
I would say,
than there was around Knockout.
yeah, 100%. I would say so. It's interesting because while it's, you know, when you think of a migration, you think of going from A to B. And in the case of testing the front end on our application, we were going from 0 to 1, really, because there wasn't much testing to begin with. But at the same time, even though there is that slight distinction, I would say, yes, I 100% see it as part of the migration, because I think a lot of the time, the hardest parts of a migration is usually not the technical piece. The technical piece is challenging, sure, not downplaying it. But I would say most of the time it's the social, it's the political, it's the convincing other people that this is the right thing to do. That is the piece. And convincing other people to change their ways. Going from not thinking about writing tests usually for your front end to starting to write these tests is a pretty big shift in how, in your day to day, even as an engineer. And I don't think I'd be particularly controversial in saying that like writing tests is typically not the most exciting part of any engineer's day. So that one especially is kind of hard, because it's like, okay, there's this thing you know intellectually that you need to do because it makes your product safer, hopefully, if you're writing good tests. And so you're bought in on an intellectual level. You're like, yeah, this is the right thing to do. But then on an emotional level, you're like, but it's boring. I don't want to do it. It's like not my favorite thing to do, whatever. And now I'm going to spend more hours of my day doing this thing. And so at that stage, we again go back to this question of like sweetening the deal. How do we make this better for you in some way? So in our case, we were thinking about, how do we make testing as easy to get started with and to maintain long term as possible, so that, you know, on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, writing new tests, adding new tests, maintaining them, changing them, whatever, feels like not a horrible slog, but that we've helped you sort of cut out some of the more annoying or frustrating or time-consuming parts. And so we've built small pieces of tooling around that. And, you know, going back to your question, I very much see that as part of the migration. Building tooling to encourage new behaviors is part of any migration, I would say. Again, unless it's so simple, so straightforward that you don't need it. This is not one of those instances, though.
Yeah, ideally, the migration is so straightforward that everyone, you can do a pure like API compatible, or, you know, like you found the cut points in the back end. We don't have to migrate the back end. But
Right.
we live in the real world. That's not always possible.
Yeah,
What was?
Oh, sorry.
Tell me a little bit more about tooling. I want to understand what worked. So, what were some of the tools that you built that worked really well?
Some of the tools that we built that work really well. one tool that I built was to, and this I think Turn would have been really helpful if it existed back then, was to take, was to take these are called eco files. I forget I think they're like embedded CoffeeScript something, or embedded CoffeeScript. I think that's what they're called. They're essentially like template files, but for CoffeeScript specifically. And they were this weird type of file that we just wanted to get out of, because it basically meant that we had to continue to be able to support, being able to template them, convert them into a real HTML file and all that stuff. And so we were like, okay, how do we write some sort of tooling that makes it easier for people to transition off of this? And then we, at the time, picked EJS as a suitable alternative. It's more modern, it's well maintained, doesn't have sort of these weird dependencies. So we were like, okay, this helps us move away from CoffeeScript. So how do we think about writing scripts to look at these eco files and then turn them into EJS files? And we basically made that available, and it was great. We were pretty much done with all of the eco files after that in like a couple months, which in the grand scheme of this entire nearly 5-year migration is nothing. That was an instance where it was relatively easy to do the migration because the mapping is more or less one-to-one. You're just representing, template variables in one way, and then you're representing them here in a different way. There were other pieces of tooling, like going back to the testing example, where we built these sort of contexts that could make it easier, a little more declarative for you to select certain DOM elements. So you would essentially have them be like these objects that contain functions that are getters or finders or whatever, including actions. And so in the tests files, you just do like, context.button.click. As opposed to doing sci.get and then trying to figure out which class name or selector you're using and then click and things like that. So again, and then like I said, you can create, click is an easy example, but there are certain actions where maybe you have to go through multiple steps. You have to open a modal, find the right button, click, select the right, drop down, whatever. But it's a repeatable action. You're trying to test that like going through this chain of things has to happen in more or less the same way every time. So for those, we also created like these sort of action encapsulations, which again, you could, normally you'd have to repeat over and over again. In this case, you would just do context dot, button or context dot translation dot select English. And then it would just run through these various steps. And so again, you as a developer who's in this feature on a daily basis, don't have to necessarily think about like, oh, I have to first, get this elements, then click on this and do this, whatever. You just do it in one shot. So those are, and then this one was harder, right? Because it's not a one-to-one transition. Mm-hmm. You're not taking one type of file that more or less describes the same thing underlying and then turning it into another file like eco to EJS. In this case, you're saying, hey, here is, here's how you used to go through these things. Now you can encapsulate those in smaller pieces of logic and then do them much more efficiently. So those are two examples. And a third example, I'll give you a bonus example. This one was hard, remains hard. Transitioning from CoffeeScript to JavaScript generally was fairly straightforward because they're both fairly untyped languages. They're both untyped languages, and CoffeeScript is essentially meant to be sugar. I don't know if you would. I wouldn't call it that because I actually don't like CoffeeScript's syntax, but it's meant to be sugar on top of JavaScript, so it's like relatively straightforward.
Doesn't the CoffeeScript compiler like spit out JavaScript at the
essentially, yes, yeah. But going from JavaScript to TypeScript, which was the next step, was actually really challenging because now you're suddenly having to infer all these types that is really hard to automate the migration for. Even if you could, your language was untyped for so long that like there are probably bugs in your code base that now the TypeScript is going to reveal, and now it won't compile because they were always there. I guess you never hit them, but now you have to fix them. So there's this sort of weird cascade that might happen. And so automation, we found, was really, really challenging when it went from JavaScript to TypeScript files. And in a lot of those cases, unless those files were like very, very straightforward and simple, we ended up having to do many of them manually.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did your team end up doing that, or was that work that was there enough domain knowledge necessary that you had to farm it out to other teams and get their input as well?
Yes, both. So in some instances, we did it for them. In other instances, they did it themselves. And in sort of like a totally alternative scenario, rather than direct conversions, because also remember that we're also trying to migrate not only languages from JavaScript to TypeScript, we're also trying to move from Knockout to React. In many cases, we ended up re-architecting those files altogether and then replacing them with a totally new approach of doing stuff. So it was always a prioritization question of just like, ultimately, this file that if it has knockout, it's probably going to go away at some point. But in the meantime, do we care about moving it to TypeScript? Do we care about moving it to like? It's always a sort of a judgment call on like whether it's worth it to spend your time doing that sort of intermediary step, or to just sort of, wait until the moment arrives when you can just kill the file altogether and replace it with something else. Mm-hmm. And that happened over and over again. And I know that happened in our team as well as the teams that were doing their own migrations. Because I guess I haven't said this explicitly, but like the team was mainly, my team, the Fix team was mainly there to provide tooling for the migrations. It wasn't there to do all of the migrations as one team. Ultimately, the plan was, here is the tooling, Fix maintains it and creates it and makes it easier for you to do your own migrations. And each team sort of in a somewhat federated fashion does it because they have the domain knowledge. They also there's just more people to go around when you include the entire org, as opposed to just like, give a group of 5-6 people, hey, take 1 million lines of code and move it into all into this new thing. There's no way that's never going to happen, right? So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense as like a tool builder team, as the kind of engine for the migration, that you can listen, you can work with teams and figure out what is going to be the biggest impact.
And in many ways, we did some migrations too. Like, that's not to say that we never did them ourselves. We did, especially when a certain team, like sometimes you would have teams that had a front end footprint, but then 99% of the time they'd be working on the back end and they wouldn't feel comfortable doing this new thing. So we would help those teams. Or, the team would have the requisite knowledge and experience, but they just wouldn't have the time. They have to deliver a feature by a certain deadline or whatever. And so they're like, hey, can you help us pick this piece up and do it for us? And in all those instances, we were very, very clear about being like, we if we can do it, sure, we'll do it, but you continue to own this. So you should probably be involved in the review process. You shouldn't just like abandon it and be like, okay, they're doing it, we can forget. Because once this is done, you're going to maintain it afterwards. We're just here for like a little short while. So that's kind of how we managed a lot of those relationships there.
I'm sure everyone was enthusiastic about the idea of just handing off ownership of the entire front end to your team.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, always. Yeah, it's like, especially like features people don't really care about, that get touched very rarely. It's always a struggle to kind of say, no, just because you don't want it doesn't mean it's going to be dumped on us now. Like, it's still your feature.
Absolutely. If you could, I got to imagine you've learned a ton about how to write migration tools over the last 4 or 5 years. If you could build the perfect migration tool, what would it look like?
It would feel like staring into the face of God. That is a very, very hard question to answer. Yeah, see, I'm stumped. It honestly, the best way I can think of going about a migration and a migration tool, a perfect one, would probably be one that can help break a gigantic migration such as this one down into smaller logical pieces of work. Help me think about what those things are, and then potentially do them sort of piecemeal. There's no way any migration tool that does everything in one shot or a couple shots is ever going to be sufficiently trustworthy, I would say, because the scale of it is just going to freak you out, and also you're just not going to be able to understand all the things that it's doing. I don't think anybody wants to sit there and read through thousands and thousands of lines of code that some AI or whatever generated for you in one shot. So I think the biggest help that a migration tool could give me is help me think about how to get from A to B, how to break it down into small pieces that feel individually actionable, that can be rolled out without like a huge risk, and then help me to sort of either plan it, help me to execute it, whatever. But that's kind of where I'm sort of landing, just because of the nature of how varied migrations can be. And how different they look, like in the three examples I gave you, they were all migrations, but where one is like basically a one-to-one, and the third one is like, oh, this is a migration, but really you have one thing and you're creating a new thing to replace it, and there isn't necessarily a direct code link. There's a sort of link from the perspective of the user, I guess. Like, they still need to be able to do the same things. They still need to be able to. We still need to be able to support the functionality that they had previously, but the architecture might be completely different. The design might be completely different. The code logic might be completely different. So, yeah, you're replacing something with something else, but it's so hard when you look at the code side by side to see how it ever could have felt like a migration, even, because it's like, oh, this was one thing and now this is another.
Right. It's at that level. Migrations are just engineering. I have this, want this, and how do I do it? So it's a hard question to answer.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I think your point about, the fact that it is a hard question implies the answer, which is like, I want it to help me understand what is worth doing amongst this big pile of problems I have, and then I want to make sure that those problems are properly being solved, and you can see what's happening as you go through each of those sub migrations. You can understand and work incrementally against the larger problem and ship incrementally, right? That you don't.
Absolutely.
I love the idea of waving a magic wand and having everything work, but anything that isn't like 100% that is totally useless.
Right. And most hard problems are not 100% that.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think, this goes back to something I had also said earlier, is that like part of this breaking down process isn't technical. Part of it is to help you communicate what it is you're doing and what the migration is even going to look like.
If you could wipe one technology off the face of the internet, never existed, what would you pick?
Facebook.
Right on. And last one, where can folks find you on the internet if they want to ask questions?
Folks can find me on LinkedIn, probably is the best one. I don't really do Twitter. I don't really do Threads or Blue Sky or anything. Maybe I should. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably the safest bet.
All right, LinkedIn. Great. Well, thanks so much, Hal. I'm glad we could have this conversation. This was fantastic.
Yeah, this was fun.